I'll let you ask the questions.
This is an interview with James R. Taylor. We're at the University of Guelph in Guelph, Ontario. The date is July 28th, 1994. Good morning, Jim.
Good morning.
How are you?
Actually, I'm fine. I've just returned from the dentist and my mouth has been reinstated.
Oh, good. And your mouth is... We're glad to hear that today. And your smile has returned.
Yes.
I wonder if we can begin with a little bit of background information, please. Where were you born and when?
I was born in Iowa, actually, in a town called Grinnell.
Grinnell?
Yes.
G-R-E-N-E-L-L, maybe?
That's close. There's two R's.
G-R-R?
G-R-I.
Oh, yes.
N-N-E-L-L.
Okay.
And I actually was born and raised on a farm, even though I wasn't born on the farm. That's what we always say, which had some influence, I think, on my attitudes towards landscape in itself. That was back in 1940.
1940, and what was the exact date?
June 19th.
June 19th. Just celebrated a birthday not too long
That's correct. Yeah.
And did you go to school in that area? Was that where you did your 1 to 12? And
that's correct. I went to a one-room schoolhouse. And this is really dating me, up until grade 12. And I started out as the youngest person in school, and I ended up as the oldest, which in itself is very interesting because students have a hand in their own education. It was sort of vertical teaching. In other words, you would hear what was going on in 5th grade, and if that sounded more interesting than what you're doing in 3rd grade, you could sort of tune into that. And in many ways, students learn more quickly in that kind of environment, where there's one teacher and you go through all the subject matter in a day, and you either have access to it or maybe not. And even in landscape architecture here at the University of Guelph now, we occasionally look at that in terms of doing what we call a vertical studio, where we throw all classes together and they work on a project and they learn from each other. The young ones learn from the old ones. So even though most people at the time would say the quality of education at a one-room schoolhouse is going to be pretty limited because you don't have the resources, I would argue that to some extent, in that it was just a different kind of learning experience.
And did you do that right to grade 12?
Yep.
All the way through?
So I had a tremendous shock when I went into Grinnell to high school, because I was just a little rural boy, and I went from the king of the hill, top guy in the whole school, oldest person, to one of 110. You know, I was sort of a nobody. And of course, the same thing happened when I went to university. I worked my way up in high school, and then I started over again at university. That's life.
Where did you do your university training?
I did my BLA at Iowa State University.
And where is that?
That's in Ames, Iowa.
Ames? And is that near Grinnell?
That's within a morning's drive. It's reasonably close. It's north of Des Moines.
And is that why you chose that school to do?
Yes. Yeah, it was a land-grant university, a very affordable place to go. And I had originally intended to go into engineering or poultry husbandry or something like that, coming from the farm. And I discovered landscape architecture on a field trip to the university, career days. And I'd never heard of it before. And I made a decision to shift to that. Most of the other people in my class, as it evolved, transferred in later on because they didn't know about it when they first came into school. And they started off in architecture or some other field and then discovered landscape architecture. So I was one of the few that had started from scratch.
And that would have been about 1959,
58.
58. And was that a very uncommon course of study at an undergraduate level in the United States at that time? No,
it's landscape architecture started as a degree course at Harvard at the turn of the century. And Iowa State had one of the older programs. The kids started shortly after Harvard. And many of the land grant institutions in the U.S. picked up on this concept of landscape architecture related to horticulture, related to other fields. And so there were quite a number of programs even back in 1920. And so it was a well-known field, especially in agricultural colleges right across the United States. So it wasn't as unheard of or unique in the U.S. as it was in Canada when I first came here. Because the programs were just starting back in 1966 in Canada. So it was understood and reasonably well known. When I went on my career day trip, though, I won a drafting set as well in a draw, but I won that from the engineers. And then I took it over to landscape architecture and used it there.
I wonder if there's a metaphor there that's important.
Yeah, I had a brush with engineering, but that was about it. They were trying to bribe me to come in.
Who were some of the people that you studied with in your undergraduate?
Well, no one famous.
Okay.
And most of those gentlemen have passed away now. There was... let me reconstruct my thinking here. We had a professor named Black Bart. I've got to better get his real name. A gentleman that we had a lot of respect for, but he had some traits that we thought were a little bit odd. And he spent a lot of time with us in the studio. And you may want to stop it for a minute while I reconstruct these people. So to carry on with your question, probably the most colorful professor I had was R.R. Rothacker. And he was nearing retirement age at the time, and he taught plant material. And he taught it by going out into the field and not only looking at plants, but tasting them, chewing on bark, the whole experiential thing. And I was quite influenced by him. He was a very colorful kind of guy, and you tended to learn from someone like that. And he had a cold remedy that he strongly recommended and that he used all the time, and that was sucking on lemons. So he was sucking on a lemon quite often. And so the whole class eventually would be sucking on lemons if a cold epidemic was going around. Thomas Barton was more or less the lead design professor at that time, but it was a fairly small faculty. There was another man named Hansen, who was an extremely good designer, but had a horrible stutter and didn't give lectures. But he would come, sit at your desk, roll out some paper over your drawing, and graphically show you what you should be doing. And was very good at doing that. It was really interesting how he handled that. So that's how I spent my first 4 years in landscape architecture.
Did you go into that program with some good graphic skills? Had you done anything along any artistic line before that?
Only on my own. I always doodled, and I liked to design things, primarily cars and things like that. Mm-hmm. So I did a lot of drawing, and I did some life drawings and so on. Very limited exposure in high school to any kind of art classes because I was taking agriculture in high school. So a lot of it was sort of self-taught, and I guess I had a bit of a talent that I began to develop. But it wasn't until university that I had a chance to really formally get some training, and then I began to move with it. It took a while because some of the students had more background than I had, and I was very impressed with them and almost depressed because they were so good.
And did you go right into a graduate program from there then?
Yes, I did, and that was very unusual for the time. There were so many jobs back in 1962 that most people were quite satisfied with a bachelor's degree in landscape architecture, and there was a really limited need to go forward because there wasn't really that much research being done in landscape at that time. So the only reason people would go to graduate school is if they had some aspiration to teach. And in the back of my mind, I thought, well, that's something I might want to do. But I also felt that there might be more to education than I got at Iowa State, and it was sort of focused, and it was very traditional. So I decided to apply to graduate programs, and I selected University of California at Berkeley. So I worked that summer in Minneapolis, and then I went out to Berkeley to start that fall. So I went right on through.
And why Berkeley?
Well, I considered 3 schools. I considered Harvard, I considered Michigan, and I considered Berkeley. And at the time, they were probably considered the best schools, although Berkeley probably was number 3. Harvard was just too expensive for me, and I couldn't see the return on investment, so to speak. And my dealings with Harvard was very cold, very stiff. Michigan was okay, but it was more or less the same kind of physical environment as Iowa. So I wanted to go west, and everything was happening in California anyway. And it turned out to be a very good decision. I also received a fellowship there, so that sort of, and I had some personal contact with the director, who was named Punk Vaughn, who was a very famous California landscape architect, and that swayed me, and it didn't have quite the prestige then as maybe Harvard or Michigan did, but it was more fun.
And who were some of the people you studied with there?
Well, there was Punk Vaughn. His real first name was Leland. He was a buddy of Thomas Church, and Thomas Church was still alive then and came in and gave lectures. Garrett Ekbo was available and taught courses. And then the most influential people on faculty were Geraldine Knight Scott, who was an exceptional studio person and had tremendous knowledge of plants and planting design. And a Japanese-American woman named May Arbogast, who was also very good. The sessional people that came in probably had the most impact on us as a class, and they were Robert Royston, who I later worked with, and Lawrence Halprin. So at that time at Berkeley, there were some incredible people that were doing things, very high-profile things, that had access to the university there. And I would say was second only to Harvard in terms of the caliber of people that were influencing students. So that was tremendous. And through that exposure, I had an opportunity to work with Royston's office, which I did for about 3 years. And I spent a little time in Halprin's office, which gave me kind of an insight during Christmas holidays. I was able to get a job there. And I got some insights in terms of how he operated then. And he was rapidly becoming the most famous landscape architect at the time in the United States. So those were really good times. The approach of the two men were quite different. Halprin was very 1960s and was kind of a hippie himself in terms of how he dressed and his attitude towards design. His wife was a famous dancing instructor and dancer, Anne Halprin. So the arts was really a part of his family and their whole approach. And so his classes tended to be sort of experiential. We were trying to develop notation systems for identifying how spaces operated and how we might describe them and design them. Royston was a little more conventional, but exceptionally good. So I felt very privileged to have that kind of exposure. Church, of course, was extremely thoughtful kind of person. He was nearing retirement at the time. And all these people had strong characters, and showed the importance of having a sort of a flamboyant character to be a landscape architect, which I was never successfully able to emulate. But it opened some new doors for me, because I always thought of landscape architecture as being kind of a quiet profession that was doing wonderful work and you did it for your own enjoyment. But these people in California were saying, no, landscape architecture can change the world, and we're going to be out there doing it, and we're going to be well known. And so that was kind of a nice role model to have. Halpern, for example, had his own public relations agent, and that was probably the first time ever a landscape architect had a public relations person. He also had a writer that worked in his office that helped him write his books. And he was starting to turn out books at the time. That was more or less unheard of, because landscape architects just didn't write. So that whole environment was really very exciting. The idea of working in an office in a warehouse, and these trendy kinds of things. And later on, I remember seeing his office being featured as a set in a movie. So it was very San Francisco, and it was very now at the time. I attended one of his parties, just to conclude on Halpern, which was a happening. And so in this old warehouse, his graduate students and his staff got together and generated an experience for the people that would come to his office for this party. It was a cocktail party. So what would happen is they would arrive. It was this old freight elevator. We brought them down into the bowels of this building, which was an old warehouse sales kind of thing, import place, so which had gone out of business. So down in the basement were all these interesting objects and abandoned pieces of furniture and artifacts and so on. So we created a whole sequence down there, and it was pitch dark, and there was music, and there was things happening, and people would move through rooms, and things would happen, and they would come back up and have a few martinis. And we thought we were the leaders in the world. We were doing the most exciting things than anyone else, and maybe we were at the time. So it was a tremendous experience. Yeah.
And then you said you worked with Royston?
Well, before that, I was winding down. I was working on my thesis and rapidly running out of money. In fact, I had run out of money and had to pick out a student loan. So, as most people did. So I thought, well, I better get a job. And I had a contact there that said, well, why don't you try a firm called John Carl Wernicke, who at the time was an extremely well-known American architect. But he had a multidisciplinary firm, and he had a division, a landscape architectural division, engineering division, and architecture. And he was a close personal friend of Jack Kennedy's. Sounded exciting, and I'd never worked in a multidisciplinary firm setup, and I hadn't worked with an architect. So I thought the experience would be useful. And the individual that was running the department was named Michael Painter, who has gone on his own since then, and has won many, many awards, and is really an excellent designer. He's one of the best designers I've ever worked for. So that was a very useful kind of experience. We were doing work in Hawaii and Washington, Lafayette Square, right behind the White House, and things that probably had some spinoff from the Kennedys, Kennedy was president at the time. And this is a side story, but after John was assassinated, Paul went out with Jackie for a while, or John Carl, I should say. And so that was exciting, because you never knew when maybe Jackie would come through the office. Although I almost never saw John Carl either. He was always gone. But I grew itchy to get back into, after about a year, I didn't like the idea of fixing up buildings for architects. So, and Royston's work was just really diverse and some interesting things happening. So one of my classmates in graduate school convinced me to shift over there. I think even for less money. I don't remember. And then I'd never regretted it. it was a great organization to work for. It was called Royston, Hanamoto, Mays, and Beck at the time. And he was Royston was a former associate of ECBO, and all those people worked together in California in the early days. So I worked there for a number of years until 1966. And during that period of time, I went through the military, the U.S. Military Reserve, and then went to Europe for an extended trip. And I traveled with a fellow named Tom Vent, whose father was very high up in the U.S. Park Service and had worked in Toronto with project planners for a while. So he talked a lot about Canada. Also, in the last year of graduate school, I met an individual named Cameron Mann, who was from Winnipeg, studying to get his master's in landscape architecture at Berkeley. And later on, Cameron came to Royston's office to work, so we got to know each other quite well. So away I went to Europe, and I started getting little notes at Thomas Cook from Cameron saying, "Hey, back in Winnipeg now, really doing well. Why don't you come back and work up here for a little while? I need help." And so when I came back, I had a real choice to make whether to go back to California and just do my career there or go up to Winnipeg. I'd never been up there. I'd been to Detroit before, but I'd never had any experience in Canada. My experience in Canada was to drive under the Detroit Tunnel to Windsor, look out the other side, and that was in the middle of the night. Say, okay, this is Canada, and drive back. So that was the extent of it. I don't even think I got out of the car. And I had this kind of a funny impression of what Manitoba would be like. I thought it would be more wildernessy. So
it's pretty much the wilderness.
Well, I mean, Winnipeg was bigger than Des Moines and more impressive. And I was kind of impressed with the opportunity. So to make a long story short, we got extremely busy and I became a partner there. And so eventually I was sent back my little toolbox from Royston's office. They kept it for me. And then they finally gave up. I'm not coming back. So that started my Canadian career.
And that company was?
It was Cameron Mann and Associates. Mm-hmm. And then fairly shortly after that, Claude Murray came on the scene. And another fellow, an engineer named Glenn Urquhart, came a little bit after that and joined the firm. So it started off then when it was reorganized, and this would be late in 1966. It was called Mann, Taylor, Murray, and then eventually Urquhart was tagged on the end. So that began to happen that way, and we started doing small commissions.
What were some of those early projects that you worked on?
They tend to be primarily for architects. In other words, sites closely associated with building projects. Cameron, with his degree in architecture and his contacts in Winnipeg, led us into sort of what we called architectural extension. And that was Cameron's strength. So a lot of the experience dealt with doing the site grounds for buildings, like there's a few that come through my head. One would be Grace Hospital. Later on, places like the Winnipeg Library, the Mint, grounds. A lot of housing.
New housing?
Yeah, multiple family housing. Mm-hmm. A few single family houses, but not too many. So it was a range of work, but the work was very conventionally landscape architecture. And that's where we were for a while, and things were rather slow, and we're very dependent on architects for work, which was a concern to some of the partners, especially the engineering partners, who said, these guys are difficult to work with, or wouldn't it be interesting if we had more responsibility? Um, do you want me to just sort of stream of consciousness carry on with
Sure.
my career?
Yeah.
Because there was another little turning point there, and then we get back. Two major turning points. First one was late in 1966, early in 1967, when Cameraman was called by Victor Chanasik, who was chairman here at this newly formed School of Landscape Architecture at the University of Guelph, and had indicated at the time that Roman Fadchuk, who I think you've interviewed, had been offered this fantastic job with the National Capital Commission and was leaving immediately, and therefore he was short an instructor. And he felt very strong that his instructors should have master's degrees. And so he did a quick inventory, and the only person he could think of was Cameron Mann, who had a master's degree in Canada at the time that wasn't so busy that it couldn't possibly be considered. Well, Cameron and I discussed it because Victor didn't know anything about me. And we agreed as a partnership that he should stick with the ship because he was the lead person at the time, and that we weren't that busy that winter, and that maybe I could go and teach and sort of fill in and take some load off the firm as well, because I could go off payroll for a little while because we were just getting organized and we weren't really making any money yet. So I took a deep breath and got in my Austin Healey Sprite, which I brought over from Europe, and in early January drove across northern North America. And it was incredibly cold. It was over 30 below when I got in this car. And this car was not designed for that kind of temperature. So I thought, to stay warmer, I will go Lake Superior route, which wasn't much better. And it was physically cold. It was a convertible, so I just had the cloth top and had a very poor heater. So I bundled up totally in Winnipeg garb and drove. And sort of drove straight through, I don't know. And it started getting a little bit warmer by the time I hit Sarnia. I think that's where I crossed over. And so I was pleased about that. And taught a couple courses here. I would commute back and forth to Winnipeg occasionally and take my car out to the airport, which would freeze solid, and I'd have to get someone to start it up again when I got back. Even in Ontario, it seemed to be cold that winter. But that was my first formal experience with teaching. The students, which included Larry Patterson, and some other people that have gone on to other things, they were very patient with me, and I was attempting to teach history. I just got back from Europe, so I had pretty good first-hand knowledge of things, and I had all kinds of slides. So here was my chance to talk about my summer vacation. But I had to do an awfully lot of reading and background work to sort of get prepared on a daily basis. But it got me kind of interested in that, and I taught some other technical courses. That was only for that semester, but I've got that under my belt. I also got married then, and came back to Winnipeg and went through a fairly long period of rather hard work in establishing the firm and staying with it till 1984. The next turning point was probably late in 1967, when a gentleman named Ronald Pellick came on the scene. We were beginning to develop, and we're starting to do some campus planning work, such as Confederation College, work at the University of Manitoba, work in Saskatchewan at the University of Saskatchewan, at Saskatoon. And our practice was really thriving. But we were presented another opportunity because Ron, who came and located in our new premises on Lindsay, had a little firm called Create Plan, and he was doing resource planning and resource inventory work and sort of the precursor to environmental impact assessments. Mm-hmm. So we'd go in there and look at what he's doing every now and then. And my training and background was pretty strictly in design. But I got increasingly interested in resource planning and landscape planning. And as time went on, we decided to join forces. And not in terms of Ron joining our firm, but in terms of establishing a new firm called Lombard North Group. And the idea of Lombard North Group would be a consortium of people that are involved with design, resource planning, resource management, and later on with Dave Young, resource economics. So we had the nucleus for a environmental consulting firm, which was called Lombard North. And the reason it was called North, or why North was in the name, is that we thought probably the big market was in the northern part of Canada, because Diefenbaker and Trudeau, the prime ministers in those days, as they came along, talked about northern development, talked about expanding the north.
And the name Lombard from the street? And
Lombard was from the street. We happened to be in a bar when we sort of finalized the concept, and that bar was located on Lombard Street. Yeah. And I came up with the word group because I thought, well, let's make it sound like it's an aggregation of individuals and firms. So what I found very interesting is that it was a very good learning experience because we were doing more cross-disciplinary work, which was rather unusual for a landscape architect to be involved in that kind of environment in Western Canada. The professional landscape architecture was so new then that people were just trying to accept the idea that you needed a designer to design landscapes without the idea of thinking that someone with a design and kind of environmental background could be involved in large projects as well, or have any kind of role to play in resource management, resource development. So it was pioneering from that point of view, and I think we were learning as we went along. And as far as an individual, excuse me, it had an influence on me, I would have to say Ron had an equal or greater influence in terms of his philosophy and where he was coming from than either Cameron or possibly even Bob Royston, because it opened up an entirely new door that I had not given a lot of consideration to.
What was his background?
Geography and geomorphology, and also business. He had a business degree from Western. So he had this idea of building big businesses as well. So we then shifted gears a bit. We continued with our landscape practices individually in our various respective firms doing what we were doing. But when larger projects came in, or these larger opportunities came in, we would do them through Lombard North Group.
And what was the actual year that was founded?
That was founded in late 1967, if I recall. So it was operational in 68. Things tended to happen very quickly then. If we got a new idea, we would start working with it and implement it. And because the economy was growing, and because there was increased activity in Western Canada and Northern Canada, there seemed to always be a need. And we looked for ways of solving these needs. So it was very exciting, very creative, and so we sort of began to leapfrog over where we might have been if we'd stayed with our little humble beginnings and started off up here. About 1969 or 70, the Lombard North Group work was beginning to overtake what we're doing as in our respective smaller firms. And this date I'll have to research, but I would say by 1973, we merged the firms and carried on just as Lombard North Group. It became evident that we really were part of a multidisciplinary organization. To do the kind of work we wanted to do, we needed access to other kinds of resources. And we needed a larger organization. And there was really no benefit in trying to run two different things. So that was a fairly major move for us. Sort of a side story, and then about 1968, Cameron made a trip out to Alberta to explore the potential in this unknown wasteland.
Just a minute here now. That's my home you're talking
Yeah.
about.
It was interesting at that time, Calgary was smaller than Winnipeg and didn't really have any bigger buildings than Winnipeg had and was rather sleepy. We came across a very receptive kind of park superintendent. His name was Harry Boothman, who was running the parks department in Calgary. And he said, gee, if you guys had a firm out here, we're developing a lot of parks, and we certainly could benefit from having a landscape architect or an architectural firm around. So Cameron came back to Winnipeg very excitedly, and we decided to then move towards establishing a little branch out in Calgary. So I went out and started the firm, hired an individual named Jeff Olson, who's now teaching at the University of California, Pomona. And I hired him from Harvard because of his computer skills, and this individual I had known from the past at Berkeley. And we began to do quite a bit of housing because Calgary was growing, but not a lot more than that, although we started to establish our roots as far as Lombard North goes and a broader scope towards landscape architecture.
Excuse me, were you the only landscape architecture firm in Calgary at that time?
No, in Calgary, yes. There was a firm in Edmonton called Butler Krebs. Pat Butler, who had come to Canada from Iowa as well, interestingly enough. Started work with Public Works and was the first landscape architect hired by Public Works in Ontario, or in Alberta. So he was very much a pioneer. There was no question about it. And then decided to establish his own firm about the mid-'60s, I would think. We were really the first firm that I organized ourselves in a professional way. As far as I know, there were probably people there prior to that. I think there was some guy doing some consulting. So we were pioneering from that point of view. But I have to admit, there was a downturn in the late 60s and early 70s in Alberta, and there was not a lot going on. So I went back to Manitoba and left Jeff there to run that office. We weren't sure that we were going to be able to continue there. And there was a lot of work in Northern Ontario and in Manitoba, in university development and institutional development, housing, whatever. We were quite busy. About 1972, 73, OPEC was formed. And oil prices shot up. Sleepy Alberta, changed overnight and became a dynamo in terms of growth and building of infrastructure. So I went back out rather quickly after that, and suddenly there was so much work coming in. And then within about 3 years, it became the head office because there's so much more happening there than in Winnipeg. And Winnipeg became kind of a sleepy little office. So that's the way life was on the prairies. Opportunities, moving 1,000 miles this way or 1,000 miles that way. Ultimately, during the peak of that period, and that would be mid to late 70s, we had offices in Edmonton, Winnipeg, Calgary, and Victoria. And we did at one time have an office in Regina and Vancouver. Never all at the same time, but there was a time when we all literally had offices in almost all those places at the same time. So from that point of view, our firm probably had more offices and more branches than any firm in the history of Canada. And this is out in thinly, sparsely populated Western Canada, which was the way you had to do work in those days. You had to be there and develop local contacts and confidence. And if there was some kind of super high profile job, occasionally they would bring in people from Toronto for that, and we would work with those people. But Western Canada was growing in confidence at the time. British Columbia and Alberta especially were becoming much more financially independent. And so professions like landscape architecture could really develop. And all the provincial associations in that time grew very rapidly, from 2 or 3 people to maybe 80 or 100 or more. And so the profession of landscape architecture, as far as Western Canada goes, developed very rapidly within a 10-year period and sort of matured into the 80s and is, working with a very slow economy now, but has been firmly established. So those were wonderful years. During the period I was there, we formed the Alberta Association of Landscape Architects. And then I brought it into Confederation, so to speak, as president in, I would think, about 1974. It was one of the last major provinces to come into the CSLA. It came in after Manitoba, I believe, and after British Columbia, certainly, and before Saskatchewan was formed. And I guess that would open another chapter in that upon arriving at a meeting in Vancouver, I had the delegation from Alberta, and Clive Justice was president at the time. And we weren't sure whether we wanted to join the CSLA or not. We were being rather independent. And to Clive, who was a big man of about 6'6", and wore a Stetson hat, so it made him about 6'9".
And cowboy boots.
And cowboy boots. First of all, he looked like someone from Alberta, but secondly, there was no question that we had any option. We were going to join the CSLA. And by the end of the meeting, I was convinced as well it was in our best interest. And I went back and convinced everybody in Alberta that we should become a component association of the association. Shortly thereafter, I don't know whether it was a political payoff or not, but I was made vice president of the CSLA and started getting involved in the board. And later on ran for president in about, I think in a period between 76 and 78. I think I was president. It's on a little plaque someplace. It used to be in my old office, but I don't know where it is now.
Not in full.
Prior to that, I was not organized at all, involved at all in organizations. Cameron, who was still quite involved in our firm until the early 70s, tended to carry the can. He would go to the conferences. We wouldn't waste money. No one else would go to CSLA and do other things. And he started getting quite involved and moving up in that, making the contacts, which was useful for the firm because it helped us find individuals to work with us and so on. But that tended to be kind of a turning point for me through my involvement with the AALA and then later on with the CSLA and getting involved with the profession in the service capacity. And of course, I've been quite involved since that time, since the mid-70s. It's probably time for you to ask a new question.
It's just about time to
I have no idea what that original question was.
But it was a great answer.
Yeah,
it was a great answer. I would like to ask you, I think, a few questions about your early work, about the early design work that you did, specifically in Alberta. You mentioned that there was a lot of housing, of course, that was going on because of the oil boom and the changes that were occurring. But were there any other projects, did you take on any projects that you thought were particularly significant, perhaps in the development of landscape architecture in Alberta?
Well, my landmark project was Fish Creek Provincial Park, and it's one that I got involved with the ground floor. I had been doing some community work and had some contacts with some various people through the Chamber of Commerce and through volunteer organizations. And so the Premier of Alberta in about 1972 had some pressure from the city of Calgary to consider doing something about Fish Creek. Fish Creek had been long proposed as some kind of city park. It was a fairly large area. It was over 3,000 acres. And the city alone had difficulty in purchasing and developing something like this at the time. Politically, LeGeyt had some idea that evolved into what is now called the Urban Parks Project, which is just winding down after all these years. But the idea is that the province would help communities develop their recreational and environmental infrastructure and park infrastructure, open space. And they initiated some work in Edmonton in terms of the Capital City Park project, and then had some rationale because the capital set within the context of the river valley there. And they worked jointly on that with the city, and it became a very unique kind of regional park. But Fish Creek turned out to be very different in that it was a true provincial park, and to my knowledge, the first urban provincial park in Canada. The way LeGeyt decided to start this, because it was a bit political, was to appoint a citizens group to investigate the feasibility and to initiate some kind of concept and to undertake public involvement, public input, to find out what the public wanted. So a committee was formed, and I got a phone call one day, because obviously it was a very interesting kind of project. I knew about it and I expressed interest in it. And so they asked me to come down and talk to them. And I said, gee, I'd sure like to sit on this committee, or I'd like to consult to the committee. I'm not sure I should be on the committee. And
Citizens, yep, you
yeah,
went down.
So they agreed. And they put out a limited proposal call for a landscape architect and for a public relations consultant that could deal with public attitudes and maybe handle the public participation side. Because in those days, user involvement and public participation was a new area as well. And they said, well, who can do that? And they would never think of a landscape architect or an architect or engineer being able to do it. It'd probably be some kind of specialist. And at that time, there was a public relations firm whose president happened to be my next door neighbor. Had the research people that could handle that kind of thing to do surveys and find out people's attitudes and needs and their wants. So I got involved in the project, and we had a very interesting time over the first year in doing a very quick overview of the park itself in terms of physical resources and its potential, in generating some conceptual ideas that I would bring forward to the committee, and they would discuss them to decide what might be the framework for this place. The Public Relations Committee, which worked more and more closely with us because they began to realize that we understood this kind of business, we helped them develop a questionnaire. And again, it was a landmark questionnaire in that it was published in the two major newspapers and went virtually to every family in the region. We received over 100,000 replies, which was unheard of because it's an unsolicited survey, and the percentage of return was 30 or 40%. So that data was processed, and from that we got a very clear idea of people's expectations, their needs, and their wants, and what they liked and what they didn't like. We worked with that and developed our own concept for the park. It was done in a very general way, schematic way. We published all this in the newspaper several times, had public hearings, received briefs, the whole thing, and it went through wonderfully. The public hearing, everyone was very nervous in those days about public hearings because it was a new concept, but you had to do it, especially in terms of environmental impact assessment. We had great support from the conservation groups. They thought the concept was sound generally. There was a few detailed thoughts that came forward that influenced us. But we were able to then take that, develop a package for cabinet, and the committee disbanded basically and said, here's what we recommend you do. So the cabinet eventually put through an order in council and froze the land, in essence, so that it couldn't be sold further or whatever, and that the province had first option buying, and that land values would be established through some kind of process. Most people went along with that, and over time they acquired all the properties except for one major industrialist who, in principle, fought it, and he just didn't believe that the government should be able to do those kind of things, and that was fair in that principle. So he fought it, spent a lot of money, and it had to go to expropriation, and which we basically won. Because there was sufficient money in those days, the province was able to buy this without a big problem. And so suddenly, Calgary had this wonderful greenway open space system. Then the city and the province, who set up a joint committee to develop this thing, said, well, gee, we probably need someone to help us design this thing and implement it. And even though they were very happy with the work that we had done, and politically they had to go out to public tender, in public request for proposals. It went all over North America, and so we had to compete virtually internationally for the project. But we were successful, and again, that was a turning point for our firm in many ways, in that we were prime consultant for what in the end was about a $17 million project, $40 to $45 million total when you count the land costs. What we began to show is that what it was essentially a landscape architecture firm could manage a project of this scale, and so I thought that was a major contribution at the time, and I think it still is. We put together a multidisciplinary team of mostly our own people, but we did the resource inventory, the analysis, and the methodology we used for the project, I think, was cutting edge at the time. And some articles have been written about it, both in terms of how the front end was handled in terms of public participation and so on, but also how we handle the resource inventory and analysis. So there's no point getting a lot more detail about it, but we used an environmental approach, sort of a McCargian approach to analyzing the landscape with a spin on it. And one individual that worked with me on this very closely is Barry Edwards, who I think is still a consultant in Calgary, a biologist. And his ideas were very good in helping us finalize the methodology that we used. So that one I would point to as a landmark project. It came in on budget, on time. It's very popular. There are glitches like anything else, but it's been a very important feature for Calgarians. Another important project was the Cypress Hills Provincial Park project. Again, this was more on the Lombard North side. And then we suggested that we had the capability of doing a comprehensive resource inventory, look at the resource economics as well, because there was cattle grazing and there was other mixed use on this site that was quite controversial, and also look at the planning and design implications. Probably the most unique feature of the project is that we developed the first computerized database on GIS that the province had done at the time. So it was very much a prototypical kind of project. And I had a graduate student work out there last year, and he stumbled across all the information and said, it still is valid, even though they sometimes put it off in the corner and don't look at it. Really should be using it. About the same time, we were promoting Lombard North in highway work in northern development, and I had an opportunity to meet with engineers from Public Works and suggested that we could coordinate their environmental impact assessment. Again, there were very few firms organized in Calgary to even consider this kind of a project. So we were hired based on our ideas and thinking without any competition, as far as I know. And we convinced them that we should do a prototypical project on the first 7 or 8 miles, which involved, again, a computer-based inventory system, which during this period, by the way, Jeffrey Olson, who had come out to help me establish the office, was able then to apply his expertise in this area, and I was able to learn in this area. So if there was a contribution there, it was to show that geographical information systems, as used by landscape architects, could play a very important role in resource planning and in design. So that was very much a landmark project. The Trans-Canada project was as well, which evolved over the years, and to the point of Lombard winning a number of awards, including some work that Larry Patterson did in the 80s. The other really memorable project was our northern Mackenzie Highway impact assessment work, and the work that we did for the Canadian version of the northern gas pipeline, which was called the Maple Leaf line. At that time, we had about 45 people working for us in the mid-70s. A good portion of those people were biologists, biogeographers, as well as people in the recreation, planning, design, landscape architecture areas. So we looked at aesthetics, we looked at natural environmental conditions, and did a lot of mapping, and were somewhat, I would say we're pioneers in Calgary, and maybe in Western Canada, in getting involved in environmental impact work in a multidisciplinary way. There were a number of other projects that followed those, but the Mackenzie Highway and the Northern Pipeline work projects were probably the largest and were some of the earliest ones.
It sounds like you had initially, right from the early concept of Lombard North Group as this consortium. It sounds like you had some very cutting edge, leading edge kind of ideas about how the world should work. Do you think that those ideas and concepts have been carried through? Do you feel that the advancements that you made have been followed on by other companies or even Lombard itself? Do you feel that there's been a great follow? Do you feel that was a good lead and that there's been a great thing that's followed?
Not totally. I've had some disappointments in that area, and maybe it's not the way landscape architecture should go totally, but because of the skills and backgrounds of my partners and the interest that I developed in that area, we fully exploited the whole idea of getting involved in resource analysis, landscape analysis, in landscape planning, and to some extent environmental impact work. We rode that wave for a period of time and could have evolved probably into a major biology firm, if you want to call it that. I think as time went on, still a majority of the partners their roots were still in design. And some of my senior partners, such as Alex Fedorak, a period of time, left, and he's still working in Thailand. And once we saw the total animal in terms of what it was, we weren't as interested in pursuing the establishment of a big organization like that, where we'd be basically biologists working for us. And we had the opportunity, and it was more of a business opportunity than maybe a landscape architecture opportunity. So, as I said earlier, I think we showed to the world, if you will, that landscape architecture had a role to play in coordinating multidisciplinary groups in northern development, in resource development, and so on, and also bringing to bear design skills to give that a different perspective, broaden this perspective. But over time it became kind of, and I haven't thought about this, but I think over time it became kind of a business thing that we weren't necessarily interested in. The Beeks, the Montreal engineering firm, McLaren, the other big engineering firms that were business oriented evolved and became really the kinds of people that would do this sort of work. Our hearts weren't necessarily in it to stay in that at that scale. So in the late 70s, and Fish Creek was part of it, and in the 80s when we began to do some of the work for the Calgary Olympics, I would say we got back into more traditional landscape architecture, but with a bigger scope, with an environmental component that was very strong, and with the ability to work at a larger scale and serve as a lead consultant in many cases. I was always a believer that the firm should evolve towards the interests of the principals and the skills of the principals. And over that 20-year period, we had a number of changes. Cameron, for example, left in the early 70s to become chair of the department at University of California in Pomona. And his background was in architecture and landscape architecture. Is very much more traditional in terms of his look at the field, more physically design oriented. Ron took a bigger role in exploring that side of the business. In fact, became president of the company for a number of years. In the 80s, when I became president of Lombard North, it did come back a little more to a landscape architectural focus. On the other hand, though, again, it showed scope. I think it opened doors for a lot of people in Western Canada as far as what a landscape architect could do, what their interests are, what their abilities might be. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question. I don't think anyone picked up on our model exactly and ran with it. Engineering firms did, but not necessarily landscape architectural firms. There's always the problem of capitalization, but also landscape architects are very different kinds of people, and they don't necessarily have as strong a business interests, more closer to design, and they may not be as organizationally oriented. Whereas in my partners, two business partners really, one had looked after the engineering side and the actual running the business. The other one was more business development. And myself, we would play with different kinds of visions and work with them. Some were opportunistic, but others things we believed in at the time. Certainly rode the tide of the environmental revolution, which started in the late 60s and carried right through to the beginning of the 1980s. It's not as dominant now.
No. And a lot of people that I have spoken with on this project have indicated that landscape architects did have an opportunity in terms of being leaders in the environmental movement and have lost that opportunity. That's something that's kind of passed them by. That perhaps, as you say, though, the opportunity did exist, and in order to continue it, you saw that it would have meant hiring biologists and simply being the business part that ran biologists that you weren't actually doing.
That's right. There's a lot of that there. So you have to think about your career and what turned your crank, if you want to call it that. When I came to Ontario, I noticed a little different style of practice here. It's not that certain firms were not large, not doing significant works. They were doing very significant works, but it was more urban. And it was more focused on the profession and a little less leadership environmentally. So the thing I always enjoyed about Western Canada, especially Alberta, is that it was open to ideas and that your credentials were not as important as your abilities. Whereas here and in British Columbia, where landscape architecture is more institutionalized and legislated, everyone has their view outside of the profession as to what you can do, and you're kept in a box, which presents some difficulties for people that want to expand the horizons, so to speak. And so that is one of the downsides, I would guess, of legislation and legally defining the scope of a profession and limiting it to some extent.
Yeah, because it limits not only what the profession can do legally, but as you say, it limits other people's perspectives.
That's right.
And eventually your own perspective.
Yeah, you're protecting part of it, but you're also maybe limiting the flexibility in terms of its evolution and growth, because landscape architecture continues to change and evolve. And I've been a firm believer on it, and that's why it's such an exciting field. It's very different than when I started out.
How has it changed since you started?
Well, I have to look back to my first couple of years in university, where we had virtually no books on landscape architecture. A few professors would come in and tell us what it is, and it tended to be rather simple in terms of designing gardens, or maybe even large gardens such as parks, even national parks. But they still were sort of garden oriented, and there was no limited connection to the environment. It was not very sophisticated at all. And the amount of stuff we had to learn was much more limited. For example, our curriculum today, compared to the curriculum I went through, is vastly different. I took some rather uninteresting courses like entomology and so on back in those days, but okay, you should maybe learn about bugs, you should learn about soil in a lot of detail, and learn about agriculture and a few other things. Today, we leave the bugs to other people. I mean, if we've got a bug problem, we'll go hire somebody. But now we have to know a lot more about the environment and how the natural ecosystems operate and how we can design within that kind of context. And we have to know more about people as well to solve increasingly complex situations. Whether it be a therapeutic landscape that's trying to heal people psychologically, or whether it's some other kind of, let's say, interpretive landscape that's trying to teach people things. It's a much more complex world out there, and I'm constantly amazed at our students in terms of their ability to absorb all this new information, plus applying the new computer technologies, which has incredible learning curve. You got to learn all this stuff and come out the other end. So I think the profession has come a long way in terms of the abilities of the people. They may have lost a few of the technical skills. They may have sacrificed a few of those so that they can better look at the big picture. But there's been tremendous change. McCarg, I think, if you're looking at people that have influenced the profession, there's no question that after Olmsted and his original incredible influence, McCarg has to be about the next really big influence. I put Ekbo in there somewhere, and Rose and others who influenced style of design from traditional to modern, and that was beginning to happen in the 30s and 40s. But the environmental movement in the 60s had a profound impact, and that's pretty much irreversible, thank God.
And where do you see that movement going? How do you see the future short term and maybe even long term?
Well, that's something we're trying to anticipate, and that's a challenge for educators because we're educating people that will be not even starting until the year 2000 and after. And so we're looking more towards a society that will have limited growth as compared to what happened in the 50s and 60s, where there was tremendous growth in population and new infrastructure and development of regions. We're anticipating fairly limited growth, which means less traditional landscape architecture. We're building new things. So we're trying to equip people, and I feel the profession will be doing more redesign of old places, either rehabilitating them or remodeling them to meet new needs, or trying to preserve them or manage them so that they maintain their environmental sustainability, or that you preserve the cultural aspects that will be important to people in the future. So we're doing less destroying. I mean, we're not going to bulldoze these buildings over here just because they're old. We're probably going to keep them, and we're going to keep the landscapes associated with them because they have meaning to people. So we have to be more cognizant of that. The whole idea of sustainability, which is a catchword and has a lot of people are saying, well, this is going to go out of style in 2 or 3 years. It may go out of style as a word, as did environmental impact statements and so on, which is now people don't talk about them every day or don't worry about them every day. I think it's probably entrenched in the way we approach things, and that when we design landscapes, they're going to have to be a little bit more self-sustaining and less resource dependent, more energy efficient, more ecologically diverse, and have to fit better. So we're trying to develop people with skills here that can work in that kind of environment. And many of our people will maybe never build a new thing in their whole career, and that's fine. Mm-hmm. They may simply be managing a landscape or repairing it, redoing it. Some of the new things will probably be to respond to our aging population, because I think it's still very important for people as they age to be very in tune with the landscape and maybe be directly involved with it in terms of growing things and experiencing landscape and the aesthetic side of things. And so I think there's going to be a lot of environmental change to accommodate that. The other thing is densification. Our government here in Ontario has just finished a study in a commission that deals with new planning reform, and one of the major things that came out of this is that we probably should stop urban sprawl and willy-nilly subdivisions of rural landscape, and that we should intensify and work within our current infrastructure because it's more cost efficient. We're not really growing that much anyway, so why build new places? Try to build in a more compact way, which means redesigning all the old suburbs, redoing them. And landscape architects will have a major role to play there. And again, retrofitting to make these places respond better to an aging population, to diminishing resources. It seems to be less money around. I don't know what's happened, but it used to be there. It's not there now. There's not enough money to maintain things, not enough money to build things properly. So we have to find new ways of doing those kind of things. So I see there's a tremendous potential, coupled with the idea of landscape architects having an understanding of natural systems, a better understanding they had when I went through school, so that they know what they're doing.
And that is something that is more focused in terms of the curriculum, is the word natural systems?
Yes, especially at this school. Now, other schools may be more urban oriented. We have a rural focus and one that relates more to natural science. That relates better to what resources we have here in the college and in the university. So we have a little more emphasis even at the graduate level on, let's say, the biophysical environment and how to design within that. We don't want to discount social environment, but we can't do everything. And so we have a stronger emphasis on the ecological side. So our students now, as a matter of course, take ecology courses and courses called biophysical factors and things like that. So that's encouraging, and I think we're optimistic. We see that we've come out of the recession now. Generally, we're placing a lot more people as they graduate, or if they're going in internships. There seems to be a much brighter picture this year. And our students seem to be, people are responding to their skills rather well in terms of their ability to work with computers and with the environment.
Do you have an ongoing dialogue with practitioners regarding their needs and their vision of the future and how the school can work with what they feel the future needs are?
We try to maintain that. For example, we have an advisory committee for our BLA program, and we have 2 practitioners that sit on that. And when we have curriculum meetings, they can comment on what we're doing. We do retreats occasionally and talk about these things. Some of our research that our faculty are doing and our graduate students are doing are responding to these very issues, where they're doing surveys to find out what's going on, for example, in computer applications or open space planning, or whatever, or they're actually looking at new approaches or hypotheses that they're developing as new ways of doing things, whether it's just gathering data or whether it's in fact undertaking planning and design. So if you take all those things, I think we're fairly well tuned in. About half of our faculty are research oriented, and so they're looking at that all the time in terms of what's new in landscape architecture. And the other half are more professionally oriented, like myself, for example, who are kind of plugged into the associations and in fact are still maybe doing some practice. Walter Kim, for example, who was our previous chair, is still very active in the practice area. So we try not to isolate ourselves too much in the real world.
Are there any skills that you feel are really lacking in landscape architects? Do you think, are there some areas that you feel that there's a major gap that needs to be filled in order for them to function better in the future?
The one that keeps coming back to us, and it's not just landscape architects, but pretty well all university students, is the ability to write well. Our students have gotten to be pretty good at communicating graphically, and many of them are rather good verbally. They get up and can give really nice presentations, and people are constantly impressed when they come in for juries. But they can't write. And our curriculum hasn't supported writing very much. We're going to have to make some pretty dramatic adjustments there, I think. But within any curriculum or anyone's skill base, usually when you do something new, you're taking away something else, and they're not quite as good at something else. Landscape architecture traditionally has traded on its graphic abilities, as with most of the other design professions. And that's how we get jobs, and that's why people hire us. They don't hire us because we're great journalists or whatever. But in this age, we're going to need those skills as well, because a lot of what we're doing is assessing landscapes where we have to document it in various ways, or we have to more fully communicate our ideas in written form. We're using computers more and just word processing more, so a lot of stuff goes in that way. So we're trying to make some adjustment there, and I think the profession needs to make some adjustment there, although it's probably going to take a generation to cycle through that. But the evidence is that you see very little written by landscape architects out in the profession. I'm not even sure of the status of our magazine. but it's barely surviving. And it's not just because people don't write, but it's a number of factors. I know Roger probably has trouble getting people to write things for newsletters and so on. I know we did in the past. So we're putting a greater burden on an individual, but I think we're going to expect the landscape architect to be able to express themselves through the written medium and video, and there's all these other new things that are multimedia. Well, I think that's probably one of the main. There are a few other areas that need to be bolstered. The basics, the so-called basics, we slip away from those every now and then, and universities are criticized because people say, well, I don't know that specific thing very well. And so it's always going to be a challenge as far as the profession goes in terms of where it is. Is it going to be technologically oriented, where they're able to solve all these problems very, very cleanly, precisely, and know the right plant at the right time or the right thing? Or will they be doing some bigger things and be able to get this other stuff done with some help? That's sort of a difficult tightrope. We feel that we've got some advantages here in having a graduate program, and our graduate students conventionally or typically come into our MLA program with other skills, and they have a stronger interest in writing. And there's some individuals coming out of that program that are be doing some really interesting things that perhaps have stronger skills in that area than a BLA would have.
Because that's one of the things that I've heard from a number of people across Canada, is that the ability to communicate is critical in terms of landscape architecture, because the image of the profession to the world needs to be communicated, or at least to the Canadian public needs to be communicated. And a lot of people feel that the profession is on a very steep downhill slide at this moment in time. And one of the ways of grabbing that quickly and rescuing it would be to do better public relations. And they feel that the public relations needs to come from people within the profession and people who can present it to a broader public, exactly through writing and through other forms of communication.
No, that's essential.
But there is really quite a very dismal view of the future by a number of practitioners simply from that perspective, that they feel there's a very strong need. And one person in particular felt that's okay to be able to communicate, but the problem is that there's not even an intellectual base from which to communicate. How would you respond to that?
I would disagree with that, and I don't know whether to blame the universities or to blame practitioners, but practitioners don't read. And I think they'd be amazed at the amount of research that's going on, the amount of material that's documented in journals and so on, that none of them subscribe to. I mean, we never subscribe to to the academic journals. We'd maybe have a popular magazine or two. So the challenge, I think, will be to bridge that gap in some way. There's no question in my mind that the body of knowledge is expanding every year very rapidly, and a lot of that work is being published, but again in academic journals.
What are some of the journals that publish?
Well, the ones that we use most are Landscape Journal, which is out of University of Wisconsin in Illinois. There's Landscape and Urban Planning out of Holland. Those are sort of the premier sort of landscape architectural journals, and that's not very many. That's just two. Then you have a whole series of sort of related magazines, and things come in every day. Like here's one from that I have on the desk here from Malaysia, Landscape East it's called. But then there are the related magazines that deal with environmental management, landscape management, ecology, environmental psychology. So it really depends on the kind of research you're doing and how you place it. Now landscape architecture is a multidisciplinary profession by nature, so it's really diverse in terms of the ideas and the things it brings together. So when you're doing pure research, it's not necessarily in landscape architecture, it's something that supports it. It might be in engineering, it might be in landscape ecology, it might be in something else. Design is more of a art. So, I mean, you can do a commentary on art, or you can do art criticism, or you can talk about design, but the hard sciences wouldn't see that as research necessarily. I still think probably the most important kinds of recognition or documentation of work is through awards programs and competitions, which tends to show the state of the art of a given profession in a very real way. It's showing the design. You can do in exhibitions and so on. So a good part of it comes from that side. And I think, again, anyone that says that the profession is going nowhere, should look at scope of some of the design awards programs. Some years in Canada, it varies in Canada from year to year because there's not a lot of people here, but looking at it globally, the kind of work that's being done, and as well as the output from competitions. And I think they'll see some really interesting things happening and some of the evolution in the profession. But I would say most of the people that are depressed probably never pick up a publication. They maybe only look at their bank balance. And that may be partially because they are rooted in the 60s or whenever they were trained, and there isn't a lot of work there. We've got to change virtually every year to respond to new needs. I think there's a challenge for landscape architecture at the moment because as it was originally conceived, it could cover a lot of bases at the turn of the century. Since then, a lot of other professions have taken little pieces of that. For example, there are a zillion environmental studies programs in North America that are turning people out that are looking for jobs. And they're doing, in Ontario I know, they're doing work that landscape architects may have done in the past. But because the work is environmental, they tend to get the job because whoever's hiring said, oh, that degree sounds more appropriate than landscape architecture. So there's a lot more competition out there. Landscape architecture still has some very good capabilities, and as you say, it needs more promotion. But there are a lot of other people out there that can do things that landscape architects used to do. They still can't do the design, still can't do the big picture. And that's where we're having some difficulty and continue to have difficulty conveying that to people. The importance of design. I think that'll be our savior. Design is hard, and biologists can't do it. In fact, a lot of them come to our program here to learn how to do that and do a master's degree in landscape architecture. Not a lot, but a few that have that interest and aptitude.
And if design is a graphic skill, yet that's what needs to be communicated to people as the ability, that's probably what makes the communication factor so very difficult.
No, that's right.
You're not trying to communicate something that is a written kind of information.
No, it's
You're
still
trying to communicate in a written form something that's graphically centered.
Yeah, and that still is very key. That's why new technologies, I think, will help us, and we're trying to embrace those in terms of video imaging and visual simulation, animation, to clearly show to people what things are going to look like and what changes might be affected. So I still see an element of design in everything if there's something proposed, or if there's nothing proposed, there may be a physical change, and that's if there's some intent that it's important what that change is going to be like. Then there's actually design. There's sort of an intervention. You want to show what that's going to look like. You want to change it in such a way that it'll be acceptable to the public and enhance the environment. So design intervention, I think, is going to continue to be extremely important. And architects, of course, are having problems now because they're trapped in their building, and people don't need a lot of buildings at the moment because we have a lot of infrastructure. But landscape is continuing to evolve, and whether it's production landscape or whether it's for recreation or whether it's ornamental or whatever. And there's constant design interventions required for that. And, other professions tinker in that, but they're not really equipped to deal with it. Mm-hmm. And some very simple things like that we need to communicate to the public. And most of them get it fairly quickly, but then they forget it.
Mm-hmm. How best can that be communicated to the public?
I think through good work and through community service, probably. And that's across the board. And I guess it's, in many ways, it's an obligation of a professional. But if you're working with other people, and if I go back to my Fish Creek example, where people sort of know you, and they also say, oh, by the way, this guy has certain skills as well, and he's willing to help the community. You can gain confidence, and confidence building is not, you have to have a certain amount of confidence building before you're hired to do something. So a lot of our students now, we're telling them in this period of time is to get, if you can't get a job, get involved in the community for a while. Mm-hmm. And make some contacts and see where that leads to, and maybe work on some open space or parks projects or whatever as a volunteer. Mm-hmm. And show your skills and abilities and get to know people and build confidence, build your own confidence, but build confidence in yourself. That's been true for forever, virtually. We did that when we started Winnipeg. We did some community service projects to show how the forks could be created. And now it's a reality. We didn't do work there, but we made the project happen, or at least got people talking about it back in the 60s.
Mm-hmm. Perhaps that's a role, too, of the provincial or the component associations, as well as the mm-hmm. CSLA, to help build that confidence in the public, in landscape architects. Mm-hmm. That as an individual, sure, that's really important because it does become a matter of personalities. But as a large association, perhaps that's a role that here OALA could play, as mm-hmm. well as CSLA.
Right. The OALA currently has a promotion program going, and I'm on one of the committees where they're trying to clearly articulate areas that landscape architects can make a contribution that people might not normally think of, mm-hmm. Such as reclamation, mm-hmm. and develop information packages and some graphics or even video backup to demonstrate a role, and then that becomes a communication vehicle. Mm-hmm. So there is a public relations firm working along those lines, not so much in traditional landscape, but in areas that we feel will be increasingly significant over the next little while in terms of employment. So I agree that's got to be done, and I think if you compare notes around the country, there's a bit of work being done there, but we've always suffered from being small in numbers, pretty much compared against any other profession that has the kind of scope and magnitude that we could perhaps get involved in. We just have never caught up to the point where we have enough people out there to do it, even if we were offered it, and certainly not people in influential areas or positions. Yeah.